Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me today. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. And don't forget to check out the America's Founding series. I did a great Memorial Day weekend episode featuring Dr. Joseph Warren. It was fascinating. I enjoyed doing it. And so far from the feedback, it seems like the audience loved it too. So make sure to check that out. Now, I'm going to talk about the one big, beautiful bill today. But before I get into that, there's something deeply disturbing going on in the far left circles. And I'm going to point out that it's not all Democrats. But when we look, last week we had an assassination of two people coming out of the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. The killer or alleged killer was Elias Rodriguez, and he's now being celebrated on the left. There are some that are calling for more violence, more death, more destruction. And this goes in line with the Luigi Mangionis, where you see that the people that are essentially evil within society, you know, the Luigi Mangiones, the Elias Rodriguez, who are killing innocent people, are being celebrated as heroes. That's a problem. And I don't know what's going on with the left, but Democrats need to get a handle on their own political party, because this should be unacceptable. And a lot of Democrats have come out, have condemned the killings, but what we're witnessing is a deeper cultural rot that's going on within our society. And it's something that I'll talk more about in another episode. But today I want to get to the one big, beautiful bill, because it passed the House of Representatives. It now heads to the Senate, and they're going to go through the budget reconciliation process. So before your eyes glaze over, because it's always hard to talk about budgeting and the fiscal issues within the United States, because a lot of times it's boring. When you start talking about numbers, people's eyes begin to glaze over. But I have to explain why this matters, why every taxpayer should be paying close attention to this bill. Now, budget reconciliation is a fast-track tool in Congress that allows certain bills, mainly those that affect taxes and spending, the debt limit. It allows it to pass the Senate with a simple majority. That's right. No filibuster can be used, just 51 votes. That's all you need. And this means that a bill that's usually going to fail in regular order is going to slide through as long as it meets the budgetary rules. And here's the kicker. Reconciliation was designed to streamline budget-related legislation, but in recent years, it's been twisted into a legislative shortcut, allowing massive sweeping laws to be passed without any type of broad support whatsoever. That's how many bills have gotten passed. But now we've got the so-called big, beautiful bill being shoved in exactly the same manner. And what annoys me, as someone that does support this administration, I support many of the policies of this administration, and obviously I support Republicans over Democrats. But here, to me, the real scandal is Congress hasn't passed a budget in normal order since 1997. That, to me, is disgraceful. That's Republicans and Democrats abdicating their responsibility to our country. That's over a quarter century. A quarter century ago, the last time the United States followed its own rules for passing a federal budget. Think about it. 1997, the Titanic was still in theaters. Instead, Congress relies on continuing resolutions. They rely on omnibus bills, reconciliation maneuvers to keep the government on autopilot. But when you do that, there's no real reforms that are taking place. And this latest bill is massive. It's nearly 1,200 pages. It spans tax reform, border security, Medicaid, SNAP, education, energy, defense, you name it, it's in there. And while some of it sounds great, some of it I do support. You have no tax on tips, stronger border enforcement, limits on the Department of Education. It's far from a perfect bill, and we have to admit that out loud. There's good stuff in it, but there is also some major red flags that Republicans and conservatives shouldn't ignore. You have massive defense spending hikes without any audits, budget increases for bloated federal agencies that have abused their power, missed opportunities to rein in this abusive bureaucracy that's been weaponized against the American people. And that's what what really annoys me. So this episode is going to be about cutting through the noise. I'll walk you through the good, the bad, and the ugly in this big, beautiful bill, because in the end, the size of the government it preserves may be even bigger than the tax cuts it promises. And I want to get into it. I want to start with what the bill actually gets right, because while it's far from perfect, there are a number of strong wins that are baked into this legislation. And first and foremost, I have to dispel all the leftists and the Democrats out there who are saying that this is nothing more than a tax cut for the wealthy. This is not a tax cut for the wealthy, despite what the media wants you to believe. The reality is that the top income tax rate stays exactly the same. There's no billionaire tax cuts in this bill, no Wall Street giveaways. In fact, the wealthiest Americans see very little changes to their rates. The only thing that it does is it locks in the 2017 tax cuts that were put in place. So now what this bill does do, it does deliver meaningful relief to the middle class, the very people who've gotten crushed by Bidenomics, by rising interest rates, and by a weaponized bureaucracy. The very people who have been ignored for so long. I mean, if we look at some of the provisions in this bill, it's certainly not necessarily in line with hardcore conservatism. In fact, you would think that many of the Democrats would support these types of legislation because a lot of it is things that they wanted in the past. But of course, now that Trump is in office, Trump supports these, they have to go against it. But let's go down the list. I mean, we have the no tax on tips for the first time. When you look at service workers who live by tips, they're not going to be taxed. And this is a huge win for waiters and bartenders, Uber drivers, anyone who relies on tips to get by. Understand, these aren't the wealthiest of Americans. You're not going to become a bartender and be in the top 20% of income earners or a waitress. These are a lot of people who are struggling to get by. Many of them take these jobs as secondary jobs. So the idea of no tax on tips helps those on the lower socioeconomic scale, not the wealthy. And I think that's important to point out, because Democrats, they want to complain that this bill doesn't help middle and lower middle class wage earners. Well, here's an example of where it does. And another provision, no tax on overtime. If you work more than 40 hours a week, the federal government shouldn't penalize you for it. In fact, the government itself should generally encourage hard work. But we've seen throughout the years, hard work has been demonized. When we look at merit and personal responsibility, those things are considered taboo because, again, the far left and Democrats, they push that DEI nonsense that got rid of standards within society. So this bill is making it clear that the harder you work and the more income you could gain, you're not going to be penalized for it. When you take that tax burden off of overtime workers, you're rewarding hard work instead of punishing it. And I think that's now another provision that many of my fellow conservatives and a lot of Republicans won't like is the lift in the SALT deduction cap. Under the 2017 tax cut proposal, the one that passed through, SALT was limited to a $10,000 deduction, property taxes and state taxes. Now, this has been debated for a long time. In deep blue states, we are high tax, places like New York and California, and it's Republicans in these high tax states that actually get punished. We pay an extraordinary amount. And people tend to think, well, if you're paying that much in taxes, you must be making a fortune of money. Well, that's not true. Here in Long Island, we have one of the highest costs of living in the entire country. We pay the highest electricity bills. Property taxes average out to about $9,000, $10,000 alone. State income tax, you could have, a family of four making $200,000 a year, and you're just getting by. You're in the middle class. You're not in the upper middle class because it sounds like a lot of money. Well, that's a lot of money maybe if you go to Wyoming. But here in New York, things are very expensive. And a lot of Republicans throughout the country say it's not fair that they have to subsidize New Yorkers, that we have a choice. We should just leave the state as if it's that easy. But the truth is that lifting this cap eases pressure on families who are being double taxed by both Washington, D.C. and their failed state governments. And listen, I understand that there shouldn't be this $60,000 a year cap on SALT with income levels over $500,000. I get that. But there has been a compromise. Now, the number's at $40,000 as far as the SALT cap maximum. I think that's going to drop a little bit with negotiations taking place in the Senate. It will probably settle somewhere around $25,000 to $30,000, which I think that everyone should support. And the reason being, a lot of people will say, well, this just benefits highlights the failed blue states and encourages more waste. Well, no, that's not true. The reality is that this SALT cap is like every other policy that we have that subsidizes it, right? Because if we really want to be nitpicky here, why should people that don't have children subsidize the child tax credit? Why should people that don't have kids in schools subsidize the education system? Why should New Yorkers and other places around the country subsidize the flood insurance program? Okay, let's be honest. A lot of people don't live in the floodplains. A lot of people don't live in the FEMA designated flooded areas, yet we're subsidizing the insurance premiums for those locations. Okay, I could go on and on about examples of government providing some benefits to people because of the places they live or because of the choices that they made, whether to start a family or not start a family. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm in full agreement that we should be encouraging people to start families. And if you want to give tax breaks to encourage that, I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that. The reality is that when we're cutting taxes, that's our money that we've made. And I don't mind helping people that need it. But at the same time, we do have to be responsible. So I support the SALT tax mainly because it's in my self-interest. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. I'm not going to sit here and blow smoke. Okay, self-interest is pretty important in life, right? And self-interest motives are what draws support for certain provisions. So it is about self-interest. At the same time, it's also being strategic. It's also being smart. And what do I mean by that? Too often, Republicans, they try and dance around in the legislative branch thinking that they're dealing with the 1990s Democrats. Well, those days have long passed. And it's time that Republicans put pressure on the Democrats, put their backs against the wall. The high-tax states, the people that benefit in these high-tax states from the SALT deduction, well, they're blue states. And a lot of Democrats hold these positions. And so now, if you have the SALT tax increase, if you're raising the cap on the SALT tax, you're boxing Democrats into a corner. Because Democrats, look at what they're voting against. They vote against no tax on tips for lower to middle class income earners. They voted no on overtime, no tax on overtime. And now you're putting pressure on them. If Senate Democrats vote no on this bill, well, you just cut campaign ads in every single blue state. You want to take these states over and get Republicans in office. This is the way to do it. Put the Democrats on record, because every Democrat that votes no on this bill, well, now you just have your campaign ad cut for you for the 2026 races. Finally, another big win in this bill is the extension of the 2017 tax cuts. You know, the idea that these tax cuts in 2017 went to the extremely wealthy is a joke. This bill extends the tax cuts that middle-class Americans got, that small businesses received. And that means more take-home pay. It means continued deductions for small business, a more competitive business environment, especially for Main Street, not Wall Street. 87% of the American people benefited from the Trump tax cuts in 2017. And so this makes those tax cuts permanent. When we look at why that's important, if this bill does not pass, you are going to see the largest tax increase in the history of the United States on income earners. It will be disastrous for the economy. So that's another good provision. There are some efforts in this bill to rein in wasteful spending, and it doesn't really go far enough. I'll talk about that in the next segment, but when we look at it, it still attempts to eliminate bloated programs, repeals unused, unnecessary green energy subsidies, and it claws back funds from the Inflation Reduction Act. What it needs to do is claw back funds from the infrastructure bill that was passed, the $1.2 trillion monstrosity, so that money could be used to upgrade the FAA systems that I spoke about a couple of weeks ago. Another good aspect to this bill is that it reasserts work requirements and responsibility. It's funny because in 1990s, you had Bill Clinton working with Newt Gingrich, a Republican Congress, and I'll distinctly remember the State of the Union address where Bill Clinton came out and he said, "The era of big government is over." My, how the times have changed. There were people, Democrats, Republicans, independents, that supported the idea of work requirements for those that are receiving entitlement programs, particularly welfare. And so this bill is going to introduce mandatory work requirements for able-bodied adults receiving SNAP and Medicaid. I think that's important because these aren't cruel or extreme. They're based on the basic principle that if you can work, you should work in exchange for government assistance. And the reason that that is so important is because working gives you a sense of self-worth. There are too many people, able-bodied individuals, male and female, that are fully capable of going to work, and yet they don't, because they've become reliant on the entitlement programs that we've had. And so we should be introducing this work requirement. It's long overdue. It existed in 1997. It was taken off by the Obama administration. And let's be honest here. I do not mind taking care of the mother that's working 2 jobs. I want to help that person. I want to help the single mother that's working 2 jobs. I want her to work 1 job so she could spend more time raising her children. What I don't want to pay for is the 34-year-old male that's sitting in their parents' basement and they're playing video games where they could just go out and go to work. That's who I don't want to take care of. That's who I don't want to pay for. I don't want to pay for the millions of people that came to this country illegally that are receiving benefits. And that's another good thing about this bill. It does tighten eligibility rules and cracks down on the fraud that we've seen. It cracks down on illegal immigrants accessing these programs. That's a good thing. We have Americans that we need to take care of first, and they should be prioritized. Our elected officials took an oath to serve us. Not the other way around, not to serve other people around the world, to serve us. And there's limited money in the pot. What that means is that the more people that access these programs, the less people are going to receive that truly need it. So when people take advantage, understand who it hurts. It hurts the most vulnerable in our society. So when we tighten the eligibility rules, that's a good thing. It also reins in the Department of Education. This bill includes strong measures to limit the power of the Secretary of Education. No more sweeping executive actions to try and cancel out student loans by fiat that the Supreme Court already ruled was unconstitutional. No more backdoor rulemaking to force DEI ideology into every classroom. So this is a step in restoring the proper separation of powers, limit executive overreach within the Department of Education, where it doesn't take control of state and local efforts to develop curriculums. It tries to remove the toxic ideological agenda being pushed in the classrooms. Now that it's going to be back with the states, we got to look at each individual state and we got to strengthen education overall. But this bill is going to limit the power of the Department of Education. That's a good thing. You have the idea of border security. So we can't overlook the national security aspect to this bill. The bill does fund the border wall, and border wall construction can start. Policy Democrats have called racist when Trump did it, but now, if you notice, they quietly acknowledge it is necessary. Many Democrats realize that the border is one of the major issues that lost them the election. Unfortunately, you see the far left of the Democratic Party, the Senator Chris Van Hollen's out there, that would rather put people like Abrego Garcia before the American people. But now the border wall is fully funded and it can be built. You have elimination of illegal immigrants' access to taxpayer-funded benefits. It expands expedited removal for criminal illegal aliens. Nobody's against that. So for all you Democrats out there, and I'm talking to the Democrat office holders that are going to be voting on this bill, understand that 80% of the American people believe that criminal illegal aliens should face expedited removal in this country. Our country has enough problems. We don't need to import criminals to give us more problems. So we see the increase in funding for ICE personnel and detention capacity, measures that try and restore law and order to the chaos that the Biden administration came with the open borders process. And the bottom line is that this bill delivers real relief for working Americans. It defends the integrity of our borders, defends the integrity of our welfare programs, and these are the kind of policies that Republicans should be shouting from the rooftops because it rewards work, personal responsibility. It protects taxpayers. It restores some common sense that's long been missing in Washington, D.C. But while there are good things in this bill, there are also problems with it. And the wins are worth acknowledging, but we also have to acknowledge the shortfall because this bill comes with a lot of government bloat, more spending, no real structural reforms, and that's where I want to turn your attention next. We have to be honest, and we have to dive into the bad and the ugly of this big, beautiful bill. Because for all the middle-class tax relief and border security wins, this bill does carry serious flaws that do violate core conservative principles, especially when it comes to the idea of fiscal responsibility, limited government, and reining in an out-of-control bureaucracy. One of the problems within this bill that I see is the debt. This bill raises the debt ceiling once again, and time again, we continue to see the debt ceiling get raised. We now have a debt of $36.7 trillion, and this bill does nothing to include any type of meaningful structural reform that begins to tackle that debt. There's no plan to balance the budget, no strategy to run surpluses, no roadmap to pay down this $36.7 trillion debt, and it matters. Okay, we are spending $1 trillion or nearly $1 trillion per year in interest on this debt. That number is slated to go up to $2 trillion in just a few years. That's double what the Defense Department receives. It's more than all our entitlement programs combined. This is a nation killer if we don't begin to act responsibly when it comes to our debt burden. It's a ticking time bomb, and a lot of Americans don't know, but in 6 months, about $9 trillion of our debt comes due. $9 trillion. See, the thing is, when this debt comes due, this debt was acquired when interest rates were at 0%. 0%. Now we're going to have to refinance that, and we're going to have 2 or 3% interest rate on it. Think about, when you're talking $9 trillion, think about what a 3% interest rate looks like on $9 trillion. That's a lot of money. But this bill, it's business as usual in Washington, D.C. We're going to spend money now, and we're going to pretend that the problem is so far down the road that we're going to tackle it later on, and it never gets tackled. This bill gives us tax cuts, and don't get me wrong, I support tax cuts. If I'm going to be able to keep more of my money, I work hard for my money. I should be able to keep more of it. When government was handing out stimulus checks, I disagreed with the stimulus checks. I thought it was a terrible idea. Not for the people that the government deemed as non-essential and they lost their jobs. I didn't mind helping out those people, but I was making my same paycheck during the coronavirus. I didn't need a stimulus check. And so all that spending led to this inflation. Now, if the government sends me a check, I'm going to cash it. Okay? I'm not one of those virtue signalers that's going to pretend that they're above it all. I'm not going to lie. Yes, you send me a check, I will cash it. But at the same time, we have to look at when we're reducing taxes or we're providing stimulus to the American people, we do need spending reductions because we do have a spending problem in Washington, D.C. It's the same trap that we've seen for decades. You can't cut revenue and grow spending on a pile of debt that already exists. So I want to say this loud and clear. You can't tax cut your way out of a $36.7 trillion fiscal hole. You can't balance the budget by simply offering tax cuts. You have to get real and begin to reduce spending. Yet this bill increases funding for most federal agencies, even the ones that I've long criticized for abusing their power. Agencies like the FBI getting more money. IRS, still funded. Department of Homeland Security, getting a lot more money. CDC, other agencies. When the CDC pushed mandates, censorship, and misinformation during COVID, well, they were all getting budget increases. I don't understand what the problem is. Prior to the coronavirus, our budget was about $4.6, $4.7 trillion annually. But when we look at it, coronavirus happens, our budget swells to about $6.7, $6.8 trillion, nearly $7 trillion. Why is it so difficult that we can't go back to pre-COVID spending levels? Why? Why can't we look at all the expansion within government during that time period and say it was completely unnecessary? We were doing fine prior to the coronavirus, so let's take that out, especially for agencies that weaponize their authority, agencies that undermine public trust, and in some cases violated you and I's constitutional right. Why are they being rewarded? This is the opposite of draining the swamp. It allows the bureaucracy to continue to grow and expand, and it represents a threat to the American people. You know, Republicans, and I've warned about this, Republicans will constantly campaign on the concepts of limited government, of fiscal responsibility, and they do the exact opposite once they get into office. To me, that's not the way it's supposed to work. These agencies should be defunded, restructured. Some of them should be completely dismantled. They shouldn't be handed bigger budgets with zero accountability. When we look at defense spending, I am someone that believes in national security. I support the men and women of our armed forces. I support a very, very strong military, the most powerful military in the world. But let's not pretend that the Department of Defense needs tons more money when the Department of Defense can't even pass an audit. We introduced the audit process within the Department of Defense in 2018. They haven't been able to pass a single audit since it's been introduced. Shouldn't we put in a measure that until the Department of Defense can actually pass an audit, they're not going to receive a funding increase? And I understand the idea of rebuilding our military. Yes, I want the Golden Dome in the United States to protect us. Yes, I want top-of-the-line equipment. But what this bill doesn't do, it doesn't rein in the waste, fraud, and abuse we see in the Defense Department. It's simply a blank check to the Pentagon. Defense spending, it's ramped up across the board. And there's no real reform. There's no procurement reform. Anyone in the military knows that the procurement process is completely ridiculous. There's no oversight. And most importantly, not a single dollar is tied to the performance of the agency. So when we look at this, does the Department of Defense need billions upon billions of more dollars? Other countries out there, China is spending about $500 billion a year. Russia, in the midst of a war, is spending $132 billion a year. I think it may be up to $150 billion a year. You have most European countries, they pay peanuts to their militaries. That's why Trump got so mad with NATO. We need to rein in the Defense Department. We need to rein in the military-industrial complex, not necessarily expand it. The funds should be targeted to what we need. National security matters, but national security doesn't mean unchecked federal spending. Another problem with this big, beautiful bill is that there's still a lot of special interests that win. It's an ugly truth, but we can't lie. The bill does preserve carve-outs for those that are politically connected. You still have the broadband subsidies, which sound nice. But at this point, who doesn't have broadband anymore? The government spending billions of dollars, and yet they never connected anyone in this broadband program, or hardly anyone. It reminds me of the battery terminals for electric vehicles, where they allotted $50 billion or so to build out hundreds of charging stations. And what did they build? 8 in a matter of 4 years? Completely ridiculous. But when we look at some of these programs, we see the waste, fraud, and abuse. We see that there is no competency whatsoever, and they continue to get funded. You have corporate tax perks that remain untouched. Now, the bill does rescind some of the wasted climate money that we're witnessing, and I think that EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin is doing a phenomenal job over there trying to find the wasteful spending that just simply went and was funneled to left-wing groups to push a political agenda rather than do anything. But much of these funds are actually being repurposed. They're not being eliminated. They're not spending cuts. They're just being repurposed for different things. So the bill talks tough on eliminating woke spending and cutting waste, but much of the federal grift is going to remain embedded. And the administrative state is still growing under this bill. I think, like I said, it's good that the Department of Education is getting their authority curbed to a certain degree, but we need to zoom out for a second. At the same time, it's going to create and expand dozens of new federal programs where we see the expanded HSA rules, we see these ideas of MAGA accounts, we see tons of money going to AI and IT modernization initiatives, and I understand that we need to invest in artificial intelligence because we don't want another country to master it first. We continue to see the bureaucratic state expand because now these agencies are going to have new rulemaking abilities, new enforcement mechanisms, and the bureaucratic growth continues without any structural downsizing, where most of the government could be cut by 20, 30, 40%, and nobody would even notice. Nobody would bat an eye. But we're going to continue. And unfortunately, the effort to break up the administrative state, I don't see that happening in this bill. And the unelected bureaucrats retain their power. Understand that Republicans like power too. This is something a lot of Americans thought when Republicans come into office, we're going to see a lot of reforms within these agencies and departments that weaponize the system against the American people. And I warned every single Democrat out there, I warned every single person on the left, that when the system is weaponized to target one group of people, which it targeted people on the right, that's not up for dispute. Well, what happens when the other party comes to power? they could easily change and begin to target their political opponents. Look at the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. It hasn't been rescinded yet. So all the Trump people have to do is remove every single reference to people on the right and naming them as domestic terror threats and just put in left-wing examples. That's why this is so important. So when we look at this bill, we see more government, not less government. Debt's going to go up, spending continues to increase, the bureaucracy stays bloated, the swamp gets richer and they remain in power. And unfortunately, we're going to be the ones that foot this bill. This isn't how we restore the republic. This is how we continue the slow decline. And while this bill is certainly better than anything Democrats would put together, we do need to recognize and speak out against its flaws. It doesn't mean I'm not in support of this bill passing. It means I'm calling out Republicans, and I understand that we have to hold their feet to the fire. It's called accountability. We don't just sit there and become cheerleaders for whatever political ideology we subscribe to. What we do is we call our own side out when it's necessary. I brought out the good in the bill, where it helps middle-class families, it helps middle-class Americans, it introduces some stricter requirements when it comes to entitlement programs. It helps secure the border by building a border wall, expediting the removal of criminal illegal aliens. But I also brought up the problems with the bill, the lack of accountability for all the red meat in the bill, the tax cuts, the border funding, the anti-woke provisions that exist. It's missing accountability for government abuse, accountability for waste, fraud, and bureaucratic abuses that have been taking place for decades. It doesn't do anything about accountability for a bureaucracy that continue to grows larger and larger, seeking more and more power, in some cases having more power than the President of the United States. So this bill doesn't dismantle anything. It's not going to dismantle the administrative state. It doesn't end the culture of reckless spending in Washington, D.C. that has given us our $36.7 trillion debt. It continues to cement it. And while there are some conservative provisions that I do support, there are also other things that I have a problem. There's no tools to stop waste, fraud, and abuse, no mandatory audits for our federal agencies and departments. Congress is not using their oversight to rein in and begin to remove some statutory authority from these agencies. No penalties for bureaucrats who continue to abuse power. No shift toward real budgeting, where every agency actually has to come out and actually has to justify its spending from the ground up, every single penny. Instead, we're going to get more programs, more rules, more layers of government, increase the red tape. So we have to look at that. We have to look at the structural problems within the United States, because they can't be fixed with surface level policies. The reality is that this bill is packed with good intentions, but intentions aren't reform. And so we need to put pressure on the Republican Party itself, since they're in the majority, to begin introducing these reforms outside of the big, beautiful bill. You want to pass the big, beautiful bill? Fine. I said I'm going to support it, because if we don't pass it, I don't want my taxes to increase. I don't want to face the largest tax increase in American history. So we see the problems if this bill isn't passed. But at the same time, Republicans need to live up to their commitment, to the principles that they'll constantly go out on the campaign trail and they'll preach, but once they get into office, they do very little about the fiscal responsibility, because I'm tired of seeing the size and scope of the federal government increase. You know, this is supposed to be the America First agenda. It's not the American government agenda. It's supposed to be the America First agenda, things that are going to improve America as a whole. The way you do that is to strengthen the people. This idea of the United States, it's about individual betterment. That the government exists to improve our lives, to make our lives better, not by giving us stuff, but by protecting our ability to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if our lives are better, if we're happier, if we have that personal responsibility, the self-worth, the drive, well, then the country becomes stronger. Instead, this makes the government strong. And I'm tired of seeing this all-powerful monstrosity. We have the federal agencies, bureaucracies that have spent the last decade targeting Americans, targeting censorship and political speak. Wrong thing. And when you give more power to broken institutions, don't be surprised when they break things again. And then another thing about this bill that's aggravating is this idea of the 10-year illusion that exists, right? That we're going to project out 10 years. That's ridiculous. Trump only has 3.5 years in office. This bill isn't going to last for 10 years. Whoever the next president of the United States is, the next Congress in 2028 is, things are going to change. And so that means that the next administration, or the same bureaucrats who resisted Trump at every single turn, if they come into power, well, don't be surprised when they introduce their big, beautiful bill. And it hurts America. That's why you need to reform these agencies through congressional legislation, not through executive orders, because they'll just simply undo everything that Trump tried to do. And if we do it through normal order in the Senate, well, then Democrats are going to need 60 votes to undo anything Congress does. So let's try and codify some of the changes. Let's begin to work to rein in these federal agencies. We need the courage to go further. You know, a lot of people say, well, if you cut too quickly, the sky is going to fall. You can't cut the government by 20, 30, 40%. And they play on fear. But enough with the fear. We need to show that we're not going to be afraid. Because guess what? If we do make structural reform changes, the sky isn't going to fall. When we did welfare reform in the 1990s, everything was fine. It improved the lives of people. Our cities were cleaner. Our cities were doing better. So we've done this before. We know what the results are. Let's begin to cut the budget. We shouldn't have to wait 30 years to put budgets through normal order. Introducing 12 bills for the departments where they have to justify their funding. We don't need a bill with a flashy name. What we need is political courage that's willing to defund, dismantle, and decentralize the federal apparatus piece by piece. And we could do it outside this bill. So I don't mind this bill passing. I'm not like a Congressman Thomas Massie. I understand that he votes by principle, and Senator Rand Paul will vote by principle. That's fine. But the alternative is actually worse. Let's get this big, beautiful bill passed, but let's push real reforms afterwards. Let's push bills that make the government leaner, that protect liberty, that actually hands power back to the American people, not the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. Celebrate the small victories. But we have to keep our eyes on the bigger fight, because limited government isn't going to come from one single piece of legislation. It's not going to come from Republicans on their own. It will only come when the people are relentless, pressuring our representatives to begin to remember why they exist and how they have to exercise statesmanship. Now, if you found the content of this episode informative, please give the P.A.S. Report a 5-star rating on any podcast platform that allows it. Also, take 30 seconds, write a good review on Apple Podcasts in particular. It always helps with the ratings and people discovering the podcast. And share this episode. Share it with your family and friends. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.